Welcome to Barnyard Language, honest talk about running farms and raising families. We are Katie and Arlene, an Iowa sheep farmer and an Ontario dairy farmer, with 6 kids, 2 husbands, and a whole lot of chaos between us.
While this is a podcast for farm families, sometimes our content isn't for the whole family. So kick off your boots, reheat your coffee, and join us for some Barnyard Language.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Barnyard Language. We're going to keep the update short today because I just had a short chat with Katie before we started recording, and she sounds like she wants to go back to bed. So we will keep it short, but Katie, what's going on the farm? What's the lambing report? I think there are animals on the ground.
In my defense, I want to go back to bed because my darling fucking children brought home what seems to be RSV, which is growing around our area.
And it's not just for babies anymore?
No, RSV, not just for babies anymore. The worst advertisement ever. Upside, it can be... Not upside, it can be fatal for babies. Upside, it is
that's
not
really
nearly
not
as dangerous for bigger kids and adults as it is for infants and older folks. So, if someone's going to get RSV, better us than lots of other people.
But you still don't want it.
No. My kids were home for 10, 11 days. I don't know, between the blizzard and RSV and whatever else. The upside is, at least it's not like my friend Jamie's school, who has so much shit going around that they got an actual letter home saying that if your kid has a runny nose, you are to keep them home.
Wow.
Not a fever, not a diagnosis, not puking. Yes, I think we ought to just close the school now. And
if you have a child, to leave them at home because...
Yes, if you have a child, please don't send them to school. My kids' classes were both apparently 25 to 30% empty all of last week because so many people are sick with this shit. Lambing is indeed happening. We're about 30% of the way done. There's nothing wood to knock on here on the couch, so I'm just going to say that it's going, and I will leave you to take that how you will. Other than that, it was 82 degrees on Saturday, and it is 40 degrees today, so at least things are drying out some.
Now, I feel like I remember a discussion at the beginning of, or whenever breeding was happening, that you and your husband had both picked out a ram.
Yeah.
Now, is there a winner yet? Are the lambs too young? What is the threshold for who wins in this competition?
Turns out that there was not adequate record keeping about which ewes were with which ram.
Oh, that makes it hard to figure out who wins.
So I'm just claiming all the nice ones. I feel like that's valid. Honestly, my ram is black and white and Jim's ram is brown. And so I'm claiming the black lambs and Jim is claiming the brown lambs, but then we have some where the ewe has had twins that are one black and one brown, but since they were in separate paddocks, sheep can have 2 different fathers of twins, much like humans can, but not normally when they're in separate pens. So, other than that, I've gotten some really funny photos of our Aussie this week, who is very, very sure that she could help with all those lambs. She's so sure that she could be very helpful if we would let her.
Well, I mean, she's kind of wide and fluffy looking.
Yeah, that's true.
She has a sheep-like quality to her. I'm sure she'd be helpful in some way.
She makes some pretty unsheep-like noises, which I think might be disconcerting for them. I did have a bit of a sad moment this weekend. A neighbor friend stopped over to pick up some salt, and we were waiting for Jim to come back, and I dropped the tailgate on the truck for us to sit and chat while we were waiting, and we realized that both of us are too old to jump as high as a full-size truck anymore. And I mean, it was high.
That is a sad milestone, when you need to pull out the step stool to get up on the tailgate.
Yeah, it is not good for our pride. I'm going to go ahead and say that I was sick.
Not feeling as jumpy as usual?
No, she was surprised by the opportunity. And perhaps if we had had a moment of better health and, limbering up, maybe some.
Oh, okay. Yeah, do some stretches first or something.
Also first thing in the spring.
All right. You work on your technique over the course of the summer.
Yeah. In her defense, they've also had like 200 some lambs born in the last 2 weeks, so she's probably pretty tired as well. I don't think she listens to our show, but if she does, hi Amanda, sorry.
There are a lot of excuses here for why you couldn't get up on that tailgate.
Yeah, mostly we're old and fat. Sorry, folks. How are things at your place, Arlene?
Well, my kids went back to school today after March break, and it was not the most exciting, but we did do a few things together. We took a couple of road trips, fit in some driving lessons for my second born who has his exit test booked for driving. So in our province, it's a graduated system. So you get like a learner's permit for a period of time, and then you do a driving test, and then you have kind of a one level of your license, and then you have to do another test to get your full license. So he's got that booked for Easter weekend. So we're doing some practicing. We drove kind of to one of the nearest cities so that he could get some practice in on the 4-lane highways, which I don't really enjoy doing with him. So his driving instructor did that. So that's much better. One of our day trips, we went into the city and went into Chinatown because that same child had been really excited for us to go to this Korean barbecue restaurant that he had gone to with friends a couple of times. So we went for Korean barbecue and all you can eat lunch. So it's the kind where they bring out the like little burner stove for you and you can cook your own meat, which does feel like a little bit more work than I wanted for my own lunch, but it was delicious. And I do feel like we did the all you can eat justice. I should have worn looser pants that day, but I did my best. What else do we do? Oh, we did cross the border and go into the States to do a little bit of shopping and go to a restaurant that we don't have here in Canada.
Was that the day that you sent the message about your new favorite American, Arlene? Thanks. That's fine.
I know, but when people give me a lot of bread, I really enjoy them. She was my favorite American that day. Let's go with that. So we went to Texas Roadhouse and there was a lot of bread consumed. One of the reasons we had gone down to Watertown, New York, was there's this small zoo. And I thought, it's, something to do for a couple of hours. And then we can go to Target and hit up Texas Roadhouse. But it was weathery that day. And apparently it's a small enough zoo that if it's too weathery, they close the zoo. So we got there and there was no zoo to partake in. So we just went to Target, which, is still exciting for Canadians who don't have Target anymore, but not quite what we had in mind.
You came to do some American watching, which can be a lot like a zoo.
That is true. Yeah, we went to the mall. So, yeah, there's that. I don't think there's too much else to report, honestly. We're still in the in-between where it's kind of winter, kind of spring, depending on the day. We don't do maple syrup like a lot of people around us, so we're not tapping trees. But I think this would be great syrup season because lots of nights it's below freezing and lots of days the snow is trying to melt, but then it snows again. So we will just enjoy the maple syrup that other people make.
Speaking of maple syrup, for anyone in our region, our neighbors are tapping trees and they will be hosting their public pancake days in the next couple weeks. It's Green Sugar Bush. It's one of the oldest family-run businesses in the state of Iowa. And they're right around the corner from us, so you should come visit. They also sell bowls, so if you need a bowl or some maple syrup.
Bowl or a pancake, whatever. You can do it all in one trip.
Yeah, come see the lambs. We'll try not to give you any germs. No promises. Sorry, folks.
I'm sure it'll be done by then. We're going to let Katie go blow her nose, and we're going to introduce our guest for this week.
All right.
Podcasts are free to listen to, but they aren't free to create. Katie and I would appreciate your support as we work to build the Barnyard Language community.
Patreon is an easy way for you to make a contribution that goes directly to making the show. As a member of our Patreon community, you get to watch the video version of our weekly updates, complete with questionable hairstyles and clutter. With 3 levels of support, you can choose a tier that works for you.
Keep the podcast going by becoming a patron today at patreon.com/barnyardlanguage. Today, we are excited to be talking to Neil Dahlstrom, who is joining us from Illinois, but I do understand that you're from the Quad Cities. So that means depending on where you're going in a day, you could be in Illinois or Iowa. Is that the other side?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I live in Illinois. I work in Illinois, but I drive 3 minutes to get gas in Iowa.
Got it. So we always start our interviews with this question because it feels like a good way to get to know our guests and for our listeners to get to know you. So we start with, what are you growing? So usually our farmers are telling us about crops and livestock, but people also tell us about kids and businesses and careers and self-growth and all that kind of stuff. So Neil, what are you growing?
Yeah, a couple things I'm growing. One is my son will be 16 here in a couple weeks. Work in progress.
Yeah, I've got a couple of teenage boys, so I know all about it. Lots of food going through the house and the fear and anticipation of driving, I'm guessing.
Yeah, a little bit. He's pretty good. Yeah, he's cautious enough. So I appreciate that and has enough fear that it's good. And then outside of that, working on my next writing projects and in the phase of doing a lot of research because I'm not quite sure what the point is yet.
You're getting to the point. And then what is your day job?
My day job, I'm the archivist at John Deere. So I manage historical records, historical collections, antique equipment, and the corporate art collection.
That is very cool. So Katie needs to make a comment here.
Yeah. Neil, my husband, is also a collector, as is my father-in-law. But our family is such that our wedding was featured in the Old Alice News as being an Alice Chalmers themed wedding, up to and including having both the letter from the editor and the center spread. And my husband also writes a column for them. So I didn't want anyone to think that there would be any issues around this. It's a fairly friendly rivalry, especially since John Deere is still in business and Alice is not. So I didn't want anyone to think that I hadn't told my husband or
This would constitute cheating, I think, in your marriage, wouldn't it?
yeah, I wasn't going behind his back.
I learned a couple years ago, I was giving a presentation in Monmouth, Illinois, and a group of about 10 people in black jackets with Alice Chalmers embroidered on it sat down, and I thought, oh no, I'm in trouble. And so I was talking about my book Tractor Wars, which ends in 1928. And so, of course, as soon as I was done talking, a hand went up. And what about Alice? And I said, they weren't significant enough yet for the book that I wrote, but they are in the next version. So actually, I spent part of my weekend reading about Alice Chalmers and the advent of pneumatic tires.
Yeah, I know a lot more about Alice Chalmers than I was expecting to in my life. Trying not to say ever wanted to, because that sounds a little harsh. But I don't feel like, Arlene, did your school guidance counselor ever offer Tractor Museum Archivist as a career option? So Neil, how did you end up here?
Yeah, I don't remember taking that class either, but I don't have an ag background. And I grew up in the Quad Cities. My dad actually was on the assembly line for Case IH, who had one of their combine factories here in East Moline. So I kind of grew up knowing a little bit, but wasn't involved in ag whatsoever. And my family hadn't farmed in 100 years. But I went to school to be an archivist. And I studied history and classics as an undergrad and went to Eastern Illinois University for graduate school to get a master's in historical administration with a concentration in archives. And I've spent 20 plus years trying to understand why I wanted to go into archives and history. Part of it was just being entirely introverted, that I wanted to study history and just do it by myself. And I boiled it down to how I like to go through other people's things. So I was just drawn to records and information. I like research. I like putting pieces of puzzles together. My son and I watched documentaries on Amelia Earhart this weekend because I just love historical mysteries, and that's what drew me to it. And there's nothing cooler than actually holding the record or the document or figuring something out that no one's figured out yet or no one's even thought needed to be figured out. So that's what drew me into the archives. The farming thing just happened because there was a job opening at John Deere. I didn't have intentions of being an archivist at John Deere.
So is there a minimum amount of tractor collecting that you have to do to work at John Deere? Is there you must have X number of square feet of your home devoted to tractors, or?
Actually, it's the opposite. So according to the Society of American Archivists Code of Ethics, I cannot collect anything related to John Deere because it's a conflict of interest. And so the way it works is if I find something of value, I have to offer it to our collection first. If we have it, if it's a duplicate, if I wanted to collect in that way, I could, but I just kind of like to draw very clear lines that I don't collect because it competes with our collection here, and that's my job.
I hadn't actually considered that aspect of it. But also it's ideal because this way, if you find something real cool, you can spend somebody else's money and you don't have any of your family members complaining about how much space you're taking up.
Yeah, that's a pretty nice perk. And I know someone else will come along and take care of it when I'm not here anymore because that's a job.
So you said you're working on a book, but you've also written 3 already. And I feel a little bad that we're doing this interview now because Christmas is not too far away. We're recording in January. And I feel like many of our listeners or maybe their partners or family members would have enjoyed your books for Christmas. But I guess there are always other occasions coming up. So why don't we just work our way through each of them and talk a little bit about the work that went into them and what you cover in them? Do you want to go through them chronologically? You can start with maybe the first one.
Yeah, chronologically, it's interesting. So after grad school, I moved out to Virginia for my first job working in an archive. It was a startup documenting the history of the commercial space industry, which really started in earnest in the 1980s. But my boss at the time, who started this and spent his entire career in space, had spent a decade researching a story of newspaper censorship during the Civil War. And I'd worked for him for, 8 or 9 months. And he called me to his office and out of the blue says, "Hey, you want to help me with this book?" So that's how Lincoln's Wrath came to be, was he didn't have time to finish the research. And so I spent a couple years researching this story of this newspaper editor in Westchester, Pennsylvania, who was shut down by the Lincoln administration during the Civil War and actually sued and won a verdict. It's a freedom of the press story. So that was the first book. We couldn't get an agent. We couldn't get a publisher. So it was just floating and couldn't really find any interest in it. So we had this book. We had manuscript done. In the meantime, the archive went bankrupt and I was unemployed looking for a job. And a friend of mine who worked at John Deere said, "They're hiring an archivist." And so I applied, got the job. So that was about 2001. And I started working at John Deere, didn't think much about the Civil War book. Was struck pretty quickly that the last biography of John Deere, the man, was published in 1948 by the family. And there just wasn't a lot out there. So I just have an interest in people and historical figures and started doing research, convinced my brother to co-write this book with me. And we started working on the book that became the John Deere story, which is a biography of John and Charles Deere. And so these things are grouped together in my mind because we found a publisher for the John Deere story, and then about a month later, had a publisher reach out about Lincoln's Wrath. So I was actually working on both at the same time to wrap them up, and they came out 4 months apart in May and November of 2005. So I went from 0 books to 2 books. And so it was very much a crash course in publishing. One was a trade press. The John Deere book was a university press. Very different approach, very different audience. So those both came out in 2005. And then it took almost 20 years until 2022 when Tractor Wars came out. And so Tractor Wars was published in February of 2022. It tells the story of the origins of the farm tractor in my mind. Its book ended from 1908 to 1928. It primarily follows the stories of Ford, International Harvester, and John Deere, and the introduction of mechanical farming through the farm tractor, just development, introduction, marketing. It tells that story through the 1920s when Ford drops out. And before anyone calls in, yes, I know Ford re-enters the tractor business, but he essentially drops out in 1928, which is when the book ends. But that project was the result of about 5 years of research. It actually started because we were working on the 100th anniversary of the John Deere tractor for 2018. So I started that work in 2016. And when you do research, you just find all sorts of cool things. And so I had deliverables for the project. I needed photos and films and talking points, and there were questions we had. But along the way, I'd find these great documents and resources, and I'd go to another archive and do some research. And We celebrated the 100th anniversary in 2018. And then I just plugged away a little bit here and there. And then over time, just continue to get sucked in. And that's how this works. I always say that books find me. I don't go out looking for them. I don't go in with a preconceived notion of what it is. I just look for interesting stories and interesting people and write it all down and hope somebody else finds it interesting too. So I try to be very naive about it.
So, Neil, I'm going to move this question up, Arlene. The Freilich tractor was actually invented about less than 20 miles from where I live. And for folks like myself who are unfamiliar, it was the first gasoline-powered tractor that had forward and reverse. And it's not talked about at all. I'm wondering what other little treasures you found along the way there, because there's a lot of forgotten stories.
Yeah. And that tractor is definitely one of them. I think one of the challenges is we like success stories. Even my research, I was very systematic where I was looking at market share. That was a driver for me. By the early 1920s, there were over 160 companies building tractors. So you have like Hart Parr in Charles City, Iowa, who coined the phrase tractor. Like they're the first ones who probably used that word. So there's so many of these interesting stories, companies that maybe had really brilliant ideas or concepts, but didn't have the resources to build or market or service. And that's what drew me to the Deere and the Ford and the IH story is you can now have 3 different business plans for how you're going to go about introducing a farm tractor and evolve it because they have different amounts of capital and different types of engineers and resources. But there's a guy whose last name was Parkhurst who probably developed some of the early Waterloo Boy tractors and tractors for 5 other brands. A former pastor named Daniel Hartsaw who developed big tractors, sold them, then developed a new brand of tractors, sold it, eventually ended up in Peoria, Illinois, and built a small tractor called the Happy Farmer. And it was one of my favorite things to come out of this research was the names for these tractors. The Uncle Sam and the Tom Thumb and the Happy Farmer and all these really amazing names. So it's the hard part of the book writing process is you have to leave a lot of these stories on the table because they don't fit the narrative. And I was reading versions of the manuscript and I would get lost because I couldn't follow all the people and all the brands, and you start editing and you get down to the core, right? But so many untold stories, especially from that era.
Yeah, it seems like you almost need a book that's just the footnotes and tiny, shallow rabbit holes that didn't fit in the big book.
Yeah, one of my favorite is there was this group that they were dubbed as pirates. The story of the tractor parallels the story of the automobile. And they had this racket, I think, in Kansas where they would go fill potholes with water. And so they were hard to see when you were driving your car. And so then you would drive into the pothole, blow your tire, and miraculously they appeared. And they would charge you an exorbitant amount of money to change your tire. And so that's how they made their living for a while. And so you just run into the equine flu in Kansas. It had a huge bearing on adoption of tractors in that period. And it just fascinates me, all the context, all the things going on that we don't learn about because that drives decisions. It's not just a company says, we're going to do this and we're going to be really dominant and it's really easy to do, so we're just going to do it. It doesn't work that way.
Was there a time period, or I'm sure it was over a series of years and maybe was regional too, when the competition went from tractor versus horses to tractor companies versus each other?
It took a lot longer than people think for tractors to supplant horses. Tractors didn't outnumber horses on American farms until the mid-1950s. So it was a really long adoption period. So you have the 1910s and 20s, you have a lot of early adopters. And then, of course, you hit the Great Depression and World War II. And so what you're finding is not horse farmers adopting tractors, but existing tractor owners who are buying a second or third generation tractor. And then really post-World War II is where you see the last of the horse farmers. Like, we can't compete. We're not going to exist if we don't move on. So I think these things always have a longer adoption curve than we think. John Deere bought the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company in 1918. They were selling about 5,000 tractors a year. In 1921, there was a pretty bad ag recession in the United States. Deere sold 79 tractors that year. And it took them 8 years to generate their first profit in the tractor business. And so there was a lot of talk about whether or not they were going to sell the business off because they weren't sure there was a future in it. And one of the great what ifs amongst tractor manufacturers is, well, if they got out of the business in 1921, which is when the board actually held a vote on the topic, things would have been a little different. But you always have that competition between these manufacturers. Also, a lot of cooperation behind the scenes, which was surprising to me. I thought everything was done in secret. That was my assumption, and that was a wrong assumption because they were just doing a lot of benchmarking.
Was the research into tractor making mostly done by those corporations, or were there partnerships with, say, like colleges and universities and academics?
Yeah, there was quite a bit of that. And really, you had a lot of crossover. So tractor manufacturers were going to auto manufacturers looking for help. And that's why you have a company like Ford going into the tractor business, which is actually complicated because they didn't want to go into the tractor business. So Henry Ford did it by himself, but General Motors went into the tractor business and lost $30 million in 3 years. So they started to find some similarities, but not enough overlap. But tractor manufacturers understood that they wanted to make machines that were as easy to operate as an automobile. But if you were a mechanic who had a reputation for being really good with carburetors, everybody wanted to talk to you. If you understood braking systems, they wanted to talk to you. So there was a lot of just these individuals who are really talented in certain types of machines that were really partnering with everybody. You start to see things like the Nebraska test lab comes into existence to standardize tractor testing and ratings because of a lot of fraud in the industry. So the company started to come together and saying, we need to have some standards so that our customers understand what they're buying because there's so much fraud in this early part of the business. So it's a lot of things going on at once.
So, Neil, one thing I'm wondering about is one thing I'm always surprised by when my husband is telling me about these sort of tractor origin stories is how many things, especially implements, were things guys sketched out at their kitchen table and made a prototype and were like, hey, look at this thing I made, and then sold it. And I'm wondering when we moved pretty heavily from that to, R&D teams, engineers. I mean, I'm assuming now that if someone came rolling up to the John Deere factory with a thing in the back of their truck, they'd be greeted probably with security and then a whole bunch of lawyers because there's so many intellectual property rights issues that I don't think we had when guys were just welding things up in their garage.
You would actually be surprised at the sophistication, I think, of the R&D organizations that were going on. And I'm glad you mentioned implements because I just think it's one of the really overlooked parts of this story, which is if you buy a tractor, your horse-drawn implement's not going to be compatible with that machine. So if you're upgrading your operation with a tractor, you're upgrading in lots of other ways as well. And there's this huge shift from all of your implements being made of wood to all of your implements being made of steel within a decade. So you have wagon manufacturers going out of business because of automobiles. A wood plow is not going to stand up to the stress of being pulled by a tractor running at 7 or 8 or 10 miles an hour. So these things, you start to see companies that built this full line, they called it, who could build a tractor and all the implements, really get a leg up. Because if you're just building a tractor, you're relying on partnerships with all these companies that just build implements. And it really gets hard to sustain that business. And again, using John Deere as an example, probably around 1912, they created what they called a horseless farm. So it was an experimental farm just so they could build and test experimental tractor-drawn equipment 6 years before they had their first tractor. They were developing, and it's, again, one of these stories. We don't look at all the things that didn't work. Deere built its first experimental tractor in 1912. They had a different design in 1914. They had 2 more designs in 1915 that they scrapped. And so it's getting something that works. It's getting something that the market will buy. It's being able to manufacture all the repair parts So it's incredibly complex. International Harvester, who'd already had more than a decade in the tractor business, they were even more complex because they had different lines of tractors. They had the Deering line and they had the International Harvester line. So they're all complex in their own way. And yeah, we don't talk about the failures, but there were plenty of them.
All right, so Neil, I've told my husband that he could ask one question. I don't know how many questions he started with, but this is the one he got down to. So this must be a really burningly intense question for him. He says, and he just texted it to me, so I am literally just going to read his question because I'm pretty sure I know what he's talking about, but I'm going to hope that you know what he's talking about. He says, Paul Harrer, the engineer from Alice Chalmers that designed the rotobaler, said that International Harvester and John Deere had built their own prototypes of round balers in the 50s to compete with the rotobaler from Alice Chalmers. And Jim is wondering if this is true about John Deere and if there are any pictures. And I'm sorry if my husband just shows up at your house, because you're probably going to be his new favorite person.
I'll make sure that I have some cameras installed in anticipation of his arrival. So I don't know the answer to that question. I wouldn't be surprised because it seems like these companies were all working on everything all the time. If I can overgeneralize this, I think a lot about, there was an inarticulated combine that was available a number of years ago. And I remember John Deere getting a lot of grief online about, why didn't John Deere ever come up with anything? I got a model of one from like 1973 designed by John Deere, and they just decided not to go to production with it, right? So I'm not convinced there's a lot of ideas that other manufacturers didn't really think about. That's a long way of saying I don't know. This is one of the challenges of being an archivist, is unless someone's asked me the question, chances are I've never tried to find an answer or look into the topic before. I think the perception is I just sit here and look up things that interest me.
Or that you are the archive and all you have to do is sort through your brain and find it.
My job is people ask me questions and I find answers and then documents that prove that the kind of historian just comes over time when you start to learn enough. But yeah, I can't say I've ever really looked into the development of round balers before.
So Neil, Tractor Wars also ended up becoming a documentary. What was your level of involvement in that? Did you get approached or did you have a burning desire to get tractors on TV, or how did that process start and happen?
I didn't have a burning desire to get it on TV, but the irony is that when I write, I think in pictures. I think of like a History Channel documentary and what is that going to look like and how are those narratives woven together. The PBS documentary came about because one of the producers at Iowa PBS received the book as a gift. So he read the book and reached out and said, hey, have you ever considered a documentary? And I said, I've considered it, but I have no experience doing that sort of thing. And so that's really how it started. So Iowa PBS was the driver behind it. I was really involved just in story, in answering a lot of their questions. What was great about it was they went and did their own independent research because, of course, they're looking for film footage. They're looking for photographs, things that I wasn't looking for. And they had an Iowa bent on it a little bit more than I did. So they covered some topics I didn't necessarily cover in the book. But it was great just seeing the progress. They would share drafts with me and we'd go back and forth. And I was providing as many visuals and documents and things out of the John Deere Archives collection as I could, but helping them navigate the McCormick collection at the Wisconsin Historical Society and some of those other resources. What was also great was I finished my research during COVID. And so like the Wisconsin Historical Society, I couldn't physically go there. By the time the documentary went into production, they could physically go there and look at some of the things that I wasn't able to actually see in person. But the process was the same. I remember them telling me that their first cut of the documentary was over 2 hours long and they had to get it to like 56 minutes. And I had a day with the book where I cut about 100 pages out of the book because it was too long. And so the processes were really pretty similar. It was a great experience. And I've got to go do pledge drives, and there was a Tractor Wars coffee mug if you pledged PBS at a certain level last year. And so there's been a lot of fun things. I kind of have a philosophy that I always say yes until there's a reason to say no. And so when they asked if I'd participate, I said, yeah, absolutely, because I just always been curious.
Sure. So start to finish, from concept to once it was out there on TV, how long did that take?
I'd say it was probably a year and a half. I know they'd done work and started piecing it together. And then we spent some time at the John Deere Tractor and Engine Museum in Waterloo. That's where I filmed my interviews. Because part of it was them saying, who should we talk to? Who are the historians and archivists that we should talk to? And of course, the list was longer than they had time for. So that's part of it too. So yeah, that was exciting. It always amazes me because I started researching this topic, and even when I'd say it out loud to myself, I was like, who is going to have any interest in this whatsoever? But I remember in 2020, the History Channel reached out and they said, we're doing the machines that made America and we want to do tractors. They'd done cars and some other ones. They said, we're going to do tractors. And we found you online. Do you know anything about this? And I said, well, yeah, actually, I'm like near the end of my first draft of a book on this exact topic.
I have a couple ideas.
Yeah. So it was just like things felt like they fell into place. But like if you set out for those things to fall into place, they never would. So that's when I talk about being naive. I've just settled on, I'm doing things that interest me. And maybe there's an interest from somebody else I don't know. I never thought in a million years I would spend 5 years researching early development of tractors by Henry Ford. It was not on my list.
So, how do you explain to non-history nerds why preserving history like this is important? Or why bother? I'm a nerd, so I have my own thoughts on this, but...
Yeah, I think it's the $1 million question. I think understanding people's motivations, their goals and objectives, the trials, the missteps, the perseverance with the successes is just so important to understanding the human spirit. You can take the approach of this kind of past as prologue. I don't believe that there's this idea of we're just going to repeat the same mistakes over and over. We do, but in a different version, because it has to be contemporary with our times, right? I heard someone years ago say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I really like that perspective because I just think we learn so much by understanding context, people involved, and it's really motivating and it's inspirational. And it's a good way to just gain that perspective and inspiration because you don't know what ideas are going to be important. And so just trying to look back and say, well, this is how someone did it in 1862, so I'm going to replicate that. Of course, that's not going to work. There's also just a lot of value in feeling like other people have gone down this road before. I don't know that there's a lot of new ideas, but there's new versions of ideas, or the market's right for the idea now, or the technology's there for an idea that was there 100 years ago. We had an engineer at Deere in 1914 who said by the 40s, there'd be moisture extraction devices on harvesting equipment and tractors would all be solar powered and electric. And it took a little while to get there. And now we're going backwards again or forwards, depending on how you look at it. But I think the joy of history is you don't know what you're going to find. And there's always more. I think the danger is that you find the answer you're looking for and you stop. And that you use it just to reinforce your existing position. Because there's just always things we don't know. And having that perspective of, I don't know, I think is really critical to just the human condition overall. It's just also a lot of fun to find things that no one's looked at in 100 years or 200 years.
So when we're talking about history, in your bio, you also let us know that you're on the Food and Agriculture Advisory Board at the Smithsonian. I'm someone who's never been to the Smithsonian, and I'm assuming that there's probably other listeners who are the same. What are some of the ways that agriculture and food are currently represented there? And are there things that you would like to see that would expand on that, commemorate things that aren't currently captured in the collection?
Yeah, obviously, I think the entire museum should be green and yellow. I think that goes without saying.
I think John Deere has their own museum already, don't they?
They do. But yeah, the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and it's the most visited history museum in the world. It's an incredible place. And food and agriculture is everywhere. I think people would be surprised. Everything from outside, they've got a victory garden from the 1940s where they're growing heirloom plants. So it starts outside, inside. It's everything from examples of agricultural equipment in their transportation exhibit, which is a history of American transportation, bicycles and automobiles, a few farm tractors in there. The American Enterprise exhibit, which is how I came in to be involved with the museum, but it's a history of American capitalism. There's a Fordson tractor in the exhibit. There's a 1920 Waterloo Boy tractor in the exhibit that talks about the transition from horse farming to mechanized farming. Part of that exhibition is also how food gets from growers to consumers. So the complexities of that and the financing of that. But you also find things like Julia Child's Kitchen is in the Smithsonian. You can go look at it. Every year around October, they host what's called Food History Weekend, where they give the Julia Child Award typically to a chef. It's 3 days of programming and films. Every month they do live cooking demonstrations. So what I love about the Smithsonian is it's not just this is the way we were. It's what do we learn from that today? How do we keep this alive? And they do that through the live cooking demonstrations. About 5 years ago, they hired their first beer historian who was there for about 3 years to put together a collection around the history of brewing, specifically microbrewing in the United States. So they just do so much around food. I went to a really fun beer tasting there one night years ago. So there's a lot of food and agriculture in there. There's a rotating exhibit of farm machinery trademark models of FFA jackets. They have Jimmy Carter's FFA jacket. They did a call in 2018, a national call, and they selected 5 FFA jackets that were donated to the collection, and one of them was Jimmy Carter's FFA jacket. So there's a lot there.
So what are some of the things that people are most surprised to see, and who decides what gets added to the collections? And third bonus question, I'm going to add it right now. Who gets tasked with telling people that you don't want their stuff? Because I'm sure there are people trying to donate things that nobody actually wants.
Yeah, I'll start with the John Deere archives. We're very deliberate about our collection, and the goal is not to collect one of everything. We use a method called sampling in most cases, which we want a representative example of something. We don't need to have one of every GPS receiver ever made by John Deere. And actually, I'd prefer that John Deere sold them versus keeping them all in the archives. But we want examples. And so you can collect an actual Starfire receiver, or you can collect photos of a Starfire receiver, or you can add some advertising. So there's lots of different ways to go about it. Same from an equipment standpoint. It's good to have examples, but bringing a new X9 combine into the collection to let it sit in a warehouse for 50 years isn't very appealing to me. So we do less of that. But I've got a small group of people who I'll go to if we make an offer. We get pieces offered every week, whether it's a photo or a document. And we'll just look at, do we have it in the collection? Is it a gap? Is it something we've been looking for? I have this mental list of things that I've been on the lookout for a long time, and I won't tell you what it is because I don't want you to compete with me. But I can tell you no one else on the planet's looking for these things. And so that's kind of the approach. And if it's something that I don't have expertise in, then I'll go out and find people who have expertise in it. And that's an important piece, which this is my secret, but I don't know everything about everything. So I spend a lot of time finding people who do know things. And I think that's what's great. The Smithsonian, they have curators and historians and archivists. But really, oftentimes it starts with you want to target something and say, hey, we have this glaring gap in our collection. And the Smithsonian is about what are the American voices and what stories have we not told that we think are going to be important. And you learn that with experience. About 12 years ago for the John Deere archives, I really targeted precision farming and agriculture. We started a precision farming group in 1993. And obviously it's about connected farms and work sites for everybody. And so how do I fill in those gaps? Do I have the business plan from 1993 that was pitched and our CEO, Hans Becker, said yes to? Was Deere early or late compared to other competitors? Who else was in the space? Who's the personnel? What's the research? And then filling in those gaps. And you think about it in terms of, if you do a documentary, if you do an exhibit, what are the pieces you need? Big, small, ephemera, meaning like advertising or photography. So curators think that way versus we want to have every one of these. That's just not how we think, because it all costs you money to acquire it and preserve it and store it and exhibit it. So that's what I have in common with the Smithsonian, is you only have so much space and you only have so many resources. And for most museums, I think the rule of thumb is about 1% of collections are out on exhibit at any given time. And I always say with the John Deere collection, our goal is not to have the biggest warehouse of equipment no one ever gets to see. We'd much rather have it be out in the world and have a collector who's super passionate about it, hauling it around to farm shows and sharing their story with visitors. That's much more important than me getting to walk by it every day and be the only one on the planet that gets to see it.
I have watched those John Deere Kids DVDs, not in the last few years because my kids have gotten older, but the one with the 80-20 reunion is one that sticks in my mind, of the people who are passionate about tractors and get together and talk tractors and all that kind of stuff. Those John Deere DVDs were on repeat in my house for several years with little kids. And on that note, I have a close family to me who don't have Disney on their bucket list, but they do have a visit to the John Deere Pavilion and all the John Deere sites on their list of places they want to go someday with their kids. So if listeners have John Deere or even tractor obsessed kids in their lives, tell us about what they would see if they came to the Quad Cities to see the home of John Deere.
Yeah, so I'll say Quad Cities and Quad Cities adjacent, specifically from our three locations. So in Moline, we have the John Deere Pavilion. So it's past, present, future of John Deere. So you'll see antique equipment, everything from, we've got a 1923 Model D tractor in there. We've got the 2 million John Deere tractor, a 4440 built in 1982 with 7 hours on it, brand new tractor on display there. An antique skidder, but you can also sit in a new John Deere combine, a new wheel loader. I think there's an 8R John Deere tractor. So we've got old and new artifacts on display down there too. There's an exhibition called From the Toy Box, which is a celebration of John Deere toys. So it's a history of John Deere toys. The oldest in our collection is a toy wagon from 1912 that's on exhibit down there. And we actually built the exhibit in a 1-to-1 scale toy tractor box. So the toy exhibit is in a toy tractor box, which is super cool. So that's the place to start. If you went 2 hours to Waterloo, Iowa, you can go to the John Deere Tractor and Engine Museum, which really interprets tractors and engines through the 1970s for the most part. There's an 8R tractor in there that you can sit in. It's going to be more of a museum feel. It's not a place you can go sit on machines, but there's 50 some odd tractors and John Deere machines, stationary engines, a replica Freilich tractor that was built in 1936 by John Deere, 2/3 scale for a movie, is on exhibit there. Plenty to see there. This summer, we're hosting a tractor show in June that goes along with our 5K, so that'll be fun. If you go the other direction, about an hour's drive from the Quad Cities in Grand Tour, Illinois, you can go visit the John Deere Historic Site, which is where John Deere moved over the winter of 1836-37. He built his first plow there in his blacksmith shop in 1837, and the Deere family lived there until 1848. So we have a working blacksmith shop, the John Deere home, and a museum built on top of the archaeological excavation of John Deere's original blacksmith shop. That was an excavation done in the 1960s. Grand Tour is a community that's just lost to time. They don't have things like streetlights. So you can go, and I've always said one of the best days of my career was sitting on the front porch of the John Deere home, watching a storm roll in and feeling the temperature change and watching the clouds come in. And it just instant transportation back to the 1830s. It was really pretty incredible. So those would be the 3 John Deere locations that I point to. John Deere's buried in Moline, so you can go visit the gravesite at the cemetery. You can actually, on your phone or online, look up the John Deere Trail. And so that's a resource where there's about a dozen Deere-related locations in the Quad Cities. The site of his home in the 1840s and 50s, some of the Deere statues we have at the golf course and outside of Harvester Works. So there's lots of John Deere sites to see in addition to sitting in a tractor and a combine.
Yeah. So you mentioned toys, and I mean, lots of tractor companies make toys, but it feels like John Deere has really, from clothing to books to the DVDs that my kids watched when they were little to all the toys, have really gone all in on stuff for young and aspiring farmers. How does that business work into the rest of what John Deere does?
I think it's a way for just everyone to have a piece of John Deere, right? Whether it's you want to wear an iconic John Deere hat, something with the Leaping Deer trademark, which turns 150 years old this year, to if you're really into John Deere snowmobiles and you want some John Deere 1970s snowmobile inspired merch, you can get that too. You know, what's fascinating about a company like John Deere that's been around for 189 years, we've been there for everything that's happened in American history during that time, right? Whether it's bicycles in the 1890s that John Deere built or the 1970s or snowmobiles. If you're a lawn and garden tractor collector who remembers getting your first 110 in the 1960s, maybe mom and dad bought one. I think there's a little bit for everyone. And I think things like licensed products and merchandise helps you connect in that way. Or you're just a fan of Americana and nostalgia. If you like cool graphics, what's more iconic than a green John Deere hat? So I think that's the role it plays. And if you're a kid, being able to play with a toy that replicates the real thing and builds in those aspirations of, yeah, I want to run a construction site someday. I want to drive a dozer. It becomes aspirational. And I think it's pretty cool.
It is pretty instantly recognizable too. Probably, I think, more than any other ag brand logo, whatever that green and yellow is. Hard to miss. One of the things my husband collects is a lot of literature, but also the company employee magazines that Dahlstrom's put out. And I'm fascinated by them because there's so much about the culture of the time and what our nation looked like, just in these employee magazines about the Alice Polo Club or who was visiting the factory that week and just all that sort of the advertising, that ephemera can be really interesting.
It's such a snapshot in time. I rely on those so much in my research because you can tell just what the corporate philosophy is and culturally what's going on in an organization just in the last couple of weeks. And this is the problem of doing research. You like go down this slippery slope. But the 1950s was such a transitional period. But I think it was about 1953, 54. There were twice as many airline miles logged on corporate planes than there were commercial flights in the United States because companies were buying surplus World War II planes and turning them into corporate planes, and they were flying executives, but mostly they were flying customers and dealers to their experimental farms or to product introductions. It's insane to think about that today.
I guess, if you think about the number of planes and the number of pilots, people who were trained to then fly those that were coming back and then were looking for jobs. So, yeah, hard to believe now, but does make sense, I suppose.
Yeah, and no one would ever look for that information. But if you've got resources like these company publications, it's also very telling when companies discontinue those publications and then they go away for 5 or 6 years and they come back. And then you wonder, okay, what sparked bringing it back? It feels like something's not going well if you thought you had to bring it back.
I think even just cultural things like seeing when these guys were going to work in the factory in button-downs and ties and just the clothing changes. And one of the most interesting things I've seen on YouTube was actually a advertisement for an 8N Ford, but it was about a 40-minute long film. And it's, a city guy gets stuck on his farm somehow and the daughter of the farm family shows him how great this 8N Ford is because it's so easy that even a girl can run it. But it's written as a movie. But the tractor is suspiciously front and center in every shot.
Yeah, there's a great documentary called Bathtubs on Broadway, I think, that's about corporate films like that. And they became big, elaborate Broadway productions. But like John Deere started making movies in the 1930s. And there were product introductions. But at John Deere days every year at the dealership, there'd be a motion picture. Like in 1953, I think, we had a film called Paradise for Buster. It was one of Buster Keaton's last films. And he is a banker who inherits his uncle's farm after he passes away, and he just goes and gets in trouble for 30 minutes on the farm. But of course, it features John Deere equipment. And just what a really fascinating era. But it drew in customers, and you'd come and you'd get a free lunch, and you'd see product demonstrations, and you'd watch Buster Keaton, and it was a community event. And then they were just disappeared. And Bathtubs for Broadway doesn't include any of these farm equipment companies, unfortunately.
Yeah. So we know that content creation and product placement are not new.
They are not new. Yeah, John Deere invented content marketing in 1895 with the Furrow magazine, which you can still get today.
So pivoting here, we ask a lot our guests to reflect on the time that they first became parents, and that usually fairly substantial change in people's lives. What comes to mind when you think back to becoming a parent and what those first weeks and months were like?
Man, they were so hard. My son's getting ready to turn 16. We only have one kid. We were very much parents who thought we can go read a book and it'll tell us what to do. But we didn't understand that when Grant's my son, he didn't do what the book said he was going to do. I don't understand. My wife's an only child, very small family. Our son was the first baby she'd ever held in her life. I fortunately had a lot of experience around babies, so I was at least comfortable with it. But I think just the stress of, he was a kid that was super, super active. And we joke with him now, he cried. My memory of the first 5 years of his life was crying. We learned later on, at least we think, he's a kid that has a lot on his mind all the time. And until he could talk, it was very frustrating for him because he had a really hard time communicating. And probably some of my least finest moments of my life was when he was an infant. I remember very vividly him wanting me to read an alphabet book to him. And I was trying to convey to him that it wasn't a book that I could just read because it was just letters, and why he didn't understand it at like a year and a half. I didn't understand. I'm pretty sure I threw a tantrum.
You both did.
And we've been fortunate. He's just a really thoughtful, interesting kid, right? That's what you want, is just kids who are interested in the world and interested in things. And he's just self-starter and motivated. But I think just seeing him pursue things that he's interested in has been really fulfilling. And so there's a lot of things now we're like, okay, we remember now when he was one, and now we feel like we have context for why he was acting that way, but also understanding how ill-prepared we were for parenthood. And we always joke because he was born and there was the first snowstorm in the Quad Cities in 25 years overnight. And we came home in a traffic jam, which I've only seen like 2 in my entire life in the Quad Cities. And that was one of them, coming home from the hospital in 10 inches of snow on a February morning. I was so tired. I remember the best ham sandwich I ever had in my life was at about 4 a.m. the morning he was born. And my wife and I were eating ham sandwiches, and we looked over at this baby who was laying over there, and we were like, oh, yeah, that's ours. We got to figure out what to do with that now.
This strikes a number of memories for me as well. I'll tell you what, that first moment when you realize that you are actually in charge of that thing. I will say I think newborns are overrated, but...
Yeah, I will say if we had it to do over again, everyone's really wonderful. They want to bring food. They want to meet the baby. They want to do all of this. The best thing I could have done is kept everyone away for a couple of weeks so my wife could recover and just recover. I think that was really stressful on her. but we were too polite. So I would have done that differently as the spouse.
Yeah, the looking back. And that kind of is one of the things I was just about to ask for any parenting advice you might have. That's one, but is there anything else that over 16 years that you've learned or someone shared with you that you would want to share with someone else?
I think just listen a lot. It's something that I've just grown to understand, and maybe that's just the personality of our son. He gets really interested in things and is really passionate and just kills himself trying to get better and understand it and learn it. And then one day he's over it and he moves on to the next thing. And he played baseball for 8 years and we traveled all over and did all of these things. And then he was just done and wanted to go on to the next thing. And it was way harder on me than it was on him. But we knew it was important to let him go on to the next thing. And so I try not to give advice because I don't think I'm in a position to give advice, but I think for us, just letting him learn who he is and evolve into that has been incredibly rewarding versus us telling him what he's supposed to be like and who he is. So it's required a lot of listening and a lot of patience and letting him figure things out on his own. So I think that's been the most rewarding part for me.
All right, so we ask all of our guests, if you were going to dominate a category at the county fair, what would it be? And categories can be real or made up to ensure that you win.
I'm definitely going with a made-up category. I don't know if you can make a category for pointless, endless research into topics no one's thought about in a long time in the hopes that one day you may formulate a thought, but I'm really good at that.
Yeah, we'll get you a ribbon. There might be something in there that makes a book, so you never know. You have to follow that trail.
Yeah, 5 years later, you may go, oh, I found another piece of paper that points to that piece of paper, and now I have a thing.
Yeah, I've got a thread.
So I don't know if you can bottle that up. I always tell people, like, if you want writing advice, don't come to me because I'm the polar opposite of how you should actually probably approach any project.
Well, if you're cutting 100 pages in one day, then you did a lot of writing you didn't need to, but you didn't know that wasn't the path you were going on, I'm guessing. So we will go ahead and move into our cussing and discussing segment. If you're a listener and want to submit yours, you can go to our SpeakPipe or our email, and both of those links are in our show notes. Katie, do you have something to cuss and or discuss this week?
I was just thinking about this, and it's a real random one. Our house is very full of throw blankets and throw pillows. Yesterday, the girl child wrapped herself up and told me she was a blanket goblin, which is fairly true. But something about children has deformed every throw pillow we own. Neil, my kids are just turned 9 and almost 8, so they're at a very specific stage in their lives. And I think there's a lot of, like setting all the pillows on the floor and sitting on top of a huge stack of them, or piling on a couch and then laying on top of them, generally using them in ways that probably weren't what the R&D team at the pillow company had in mind about how pillows might be used. And all of our pillows are just mangled. And you would think you would be able to just shake them back into shape, but they never quite recover back to the way they were. And it's not worth trying to convince my kids not to mangle the pillows.
They're already in their new form.
Yeah. In the long list of things I'm going to concern myself with, throw pillows from IKEA is not on that list. But it would be really nice to have one pillow that wasn't mangled. Neil, what do you have to cuss and discuss?
Oh boy, so many things. No, I'm just kidding. I spent the last month painting. And so I actually finished the bedroom yesterday. And of course, painting means patching walls and leaving things in not as good a condition as you thought they were going to be after you did some work to them. And then now that the walls are painted, now the carpet's nasty, and now it's another thing, and it'll be another thing. And I think 5 years from now, I'm still going to be talking about this paint job I did in the bedroom, which took way longer than it should have. And I finished yesterday, and it's still bugging me. And I should be really happy and excited that I got it done, but now I just see all the other things that look terrible. Yeah.
You might as well just move now, Neil. Because by the time this is done, you'll be, siding the garage or something.
We're being very strategic because our last house, we did an entire room of furniture and carpet, and then we listed the house a month later. So the topic is always, we're going to do the work if we're making a commitment for X number of years to live here. And we've been there 13 years, so I feel like we're okay.
Yeah, we're going to stay in this room for a little while.
Yeah, so I'm going to get it all out now so we can actually enjoy it versus just moving immediately.
Arlene, what do you have to cuss and discuss?
Mine is actually a discuss, or I guess it's a little story. This is something that my husband has told me got passed down from his grandfather. When we were talking about tractors and horses, his grandfather was of the generation, his great-grandfather was of the generation who, when the first tractor came to the farm, was convinced that wherever the tires touched, nothing would ever grow because the soil was going to be ruined, right? Because horses didn't compress the soil, but tractor tires were going to destroy everything. So he was so dead set against the tractor coming, but obviously the next generation was ready for that change. And I just think it's so interesting to think about all the changes that our farms have seen in the generations that people have worked on this land. And whether you're on a first generation farm, or I think Katie and her husband are fifth, my husband and I are sixth, our kids are seventh. But someone was on this land before we were, and they made lots of decisions and had to do things in the ways that they wanted to or they felt were right. And so I think we just always need to remember that change is going to happen inevitably, and you can either go with it or fight against it, but sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. History doesn't always prove that progress is better, but I think from what we've seen on our farm the last couple of generations, things still grow where the tractors touch the ground, so we're doing okay.
I love that story. So one of the major hurdles that John Deere the man faced was when he introduced his steel plow. People said that steel would poison the soil and nothing would grow, and that you had to continue using cast iron or wood. And because of this newfangled technology, this steel was going to literally poison the soil and kill everything.
And then there's probably been things over the years where we thought, we know, things like asbestos, we thought, this is great, it's going to be fantastic. And then you find out later that there were repercussions. What we think is the great evil isn't always the thing. And then the thing that we think is progress maybe isn't always the solution either. So that's where history maybe is important for all of us to reflect on every now and then. So we want to thank you, Neil, so much for joining us. If people want to find you online, buy your books, learn more about your work, where should they find you?
NeilDahlstrom.com is my website, and I'm really easy to find on Instagram and Twitter, and author Neil Dahlstrom on Facebook.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It was great to have this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on, Neil.
Thank you for joining us on Barnyard Language. If you enjoy the show, please support us on Patreon with a donation.
Big thanks go out to our show editor, Krista Paffrath at the Rural Podcast Network.
Please rate and review the podcast wherever you listen, and follow the show so you never miss an episode.
If you want to connect with other farming families, join the private Barnyard Language Facebook group.
We are always in search of future guests for the podcast. If you or someone you know would like to chat with us, get in touch.